Welcome. Settle in, and let your breathing slow as we prepare to drift back in time, back nearly 2,000 years, to the height of the Roman Republic. Tonight we will follow the life of Spartacus, a man who began as a soldier, was enslaved as a gladiator, and rose to lead one of the greatest slave uprisings the world had ever seen. His name echoes through history, both feared and admired, remembered not only for battle, but for the symbol he became. This is not a tale of glory or triumph. It is the quiet unfolding of a life shaped by hardship, discipline, and defiance. We will explore the world he inhabited, the choices he made, and the consequences that followed. As you listen, imagine the rhythms of ancient Rome, the footsteps on stone streets, the murmur of markets, the roar of the amphitheater, and the silence of the countryside at dusk. Allow these images to drift through your mind, holding your attention gently, but never demanding it. If your thoughts wander, let them. If sleep arrives, let it come. The story will continue without you, a steady current carrying you deeper into rest. So let us begin at the very start of the man who would become Spartacus. Spartacus was born around the beginning of the 1st century before our common era. The exact date and place are uncertain, as is much of his early life. Ancient writers differ in their accounts, leaving us fragments rather than a clear picture. But most agree that he was born in Thrace, a rugged region north of Greece, known for its forests, its mountains, and its fierce tribal warriors. Imagine that landscape for a moment. Rolling hills covered in grass, dense woods where the air smelled of pine, villages built of timber and clay, where smoke rose slowly from hearth fires. Life there was simple, but not easy. People farmed the land, raised animals, and fought frequently against rival tribes, and against the expanding power of Rome. Spartacus, as a Thracian, likely grew up with this mix of farming and fighting. Thracian warriors were famed for their skill with small, curved swords and their bold charges in battle. Children grew up quickly, learning to endure hardship, to wield weapons, and to follow their chieftains. At some point, Spartacus entered Roman service. Perhaps as an auxiliary soldier, one of the many non-Romans recruited to fight alongside Roman legions. We do not know if he volunteered, was conscripted, or was taken as part of a defeated group. But in Roman eyes, Thracians were both useful allies and potential rebels. Something went wrong. Ancient accounts tell us that Spartacus deserted, or perhaps refused orders. He was captured, punished, and enslaved. For a man raised with freedom, family, and his own customs, this must have been a shattering turn. As a slave, he was sold into the gladiatorial system. This was not merely sport, it was a brutal institution, designed to entertain Roman crowds and remind slaves and subjects of the Republic's power. Gladiators were trained to fight, sometimes to the death, for the amusement of spectators. Imagine Spartacus arriving at a gladiatorial school, called a ludus. The air would have been heavy with the smell of sweat, oil, and iron. The clatter of wooden practice swords filled the yard. Along with the barked orders of instructors, the men around him were a mix of criminals, prisoners of war, and slaves all, forced into training. Life in the ludus was harsh. Discipline was strict. Food was basic, but designed to build strength-thick barley porridge, beans, bread. Training was relentless. Gladiators practiced maneuvers again and again under the watch of armed guards. Escape was almost impossible. And yet it was here that Spartacus began to find the companions who would one day join him in revolt. Among them was a woman, his wife, or perhaps his partner, said to have been a prophetess of Thracian tradition. Ancient writers describe her as having visions, and claiming that Spartacus was destined for greatness. Whether true or not, such words may have stayed with him, providing a sense of purpose amid captivity. The stage was set. Thracian warrior, enslaved in Rome's gladiatorial machine. A man with military experience, leadership, and a will that refused to bend. For now, he endured the drills, the punishments, the endless routine of the training yard. But change was coming. The gladiatorial school where Spartacus was held was located in Capua, a city in southern Italy. Capua was wealthy, known for its fertile lands and its amphitheater, second only to Rome's own Colosseum, which would be built later. The school belonged to a man named Lentulus Batiatus, who ran it as a business. Inside its high walls, life was tightly controlled. Gladiators were divided into groups, each trained in a particular style of combat. Some wielded heavy shields and short swords, others carried tridents and nets. Some fought with curved blades, or with helmets designed to blind and limit their sight. Each was trained for spectacle, for the roar of the crowd, and for Rome's appetite for blood and dominance. For Spartacus, the days must have blurred together, early mornings with simple meals, hours of repetitive drills, learning footwork, thrusts, parries, the clang of weapons striking shields, the heavy weight of armor pressing down in the heat. Injuries were common, and punishment for disobedience was harsh. Guards kept watch constantly, their whips and weapons a reminder of the order that ruled the school. But even in this place there was a strange rhythm. Gladiators, though slaves, were valuable investments. They were fed, housed, and treated not as expendable labor, but as performers. The men trained together, ate together, and shared their dreams of freedom in whispered conversations at night. Bonds formed brothers not by blood but by circumstance. Spartacus was not alone in feeling the weight of chains. Among his companions were two Gauls, named Crixus and Oenomos. They too were strong fighters, men who would become his closest allies. Together with dozens of others, they began to imagine escape. At first it may have been only a dream, but the cruelty of their situation, the endless cycle of training and combat, made it impossible to ignore. To remain a gladiator was to live a life without dignity, with death always close. To attempt escape was dangerous, even foolish. But the thought grew stronger each day. The plan began to take shape in secret. Spartacus and his companions gathered followers quietly, building trust, passing messages, preparing themselves. They did not yet have weapons, only kitchen tools and what they could hide away. Still, they believed that if they moved swiftly, they might break through the walls and find freedom. And so, one day in the year 73 before our common era, the plan was put into action. Accounts tell us that around 70 men joined together. Armed with nothing more than knives from the kitchens and makeshift clubs, they turned against their guards. The element of surprise was theirs. The guards fell quickly and the gladiators burst out into the open countryside. Freedom, though fragile, had come at last. They seized wagons of weapons meant for gladiatorial games. Suddenly, they were not merely escaped slaves, they were armed rebels. From there, the revolt began to swell. Others joined them, slaves from nearby farms, herdsmen, desperate men and women, who saw in Spartacus not just a fugitive, but a leader. The hills of southern Italy became their refuge, the forests their hiding place. Imagine that moment. Standing on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius, the same volcano that would one day bury Pompeii, with the wind tugging at your clothes, the view of fields and villages below, and a growing band of followers at your side. For Spartacus, this was no longer only about survival. It was becoming something larger, rebellion against the system that had enslaved thousands. Still, the beginning was uncertain. Rome did not yet take them seriously. To the Republic, they were only escaped slaves, dangerous perhaps, but hardly a true army. Yet Spartacus knew the land, knew the tactics of both soldier and guerrilla. Once unarmed and hunted, began to win victories. The revolt had begun. The flame had been lit, and it would spread further than anyone in Rome could have imagined. From their first daring escape, Spartacus and his companions grew quickly in number. Word spread across the countryside. Slaves had broken free, had armed themselves, and were defeating Roman patrols. To those bound in fields and households, the thought was electrifying. To be free seemed impossible, yet here was a group proving it could be done. One by one, men and women slipped away from their masters. Shepherds brought their staffs. Farmhands carried sickles and axes. Some brought nothing but their bare hands. And so the band of Spartacus swelled from dozens to hundreds to thousands. Life in the rebel camp was far from easy. Imagine it, a makeshift settlement in the hills, fires burning in the night, the murmur of many languages. There was no single culture. These were Thracians, Gauls, Greeks, and Italians, all bound together by desperation. Food came from raids or from sympathetic peasants. Weapons were scavenged from defeated soldiers. Armor was mismatched, cobbled together from what they could find. And yet, despite the hardship, there was also a rhythm of community. At night, families huddled close, cooking simple meals over open flames. Fighters sharpened their swords by firelight. Some may have sung songs of their homelands. Others spoke of hopes for the future return home, or a world where they could walk unchained. For many, this camp, though dangerous, was the first taste of freedom they had known in years. Spartacus proved himself not only as a warrior, but as a leader. Ancient accounts describe him as disciplined, intelligent, and unusually merciful for the time. He tried to restrain excess cruelty among his men, sparing captured civilians when possible. This distinguished him from some of his followers, who, enraged by years of enslavement, often sought vengeance. Spartacus' authority was not absolute, but it was respected. Rome, however, could no longer ignore them. At first, the Senate sent small forces, local militias, lightly trained soldiers, expecting an easy victory. But these groups were repeatedly defeated. Spartacus used the land to his advantage, ambushing Roman troops, striking quickly, then melting back into the hills. One of the most remarkable moments came when Spartacus and his followers were trapped on Mount Vesuvius. Roman forces blocked the mountain's paths, confident that hunger would force the rebels down into their grasp. But Spartacus devised a plan. The rebels cut vines from the mountainside, twisted them into ropes and ladders, and silently climbed down the sheer cliffs. By nightfall, they had encircled the Roman camp. At dawn, they attacked from behind, catching their enemies utterly unprepared. The Romans fled in panic, leaving weapons and supplies behind. The story spread quickly. Not only had the escaped slaves escaped again, they had humiliated Rome's soldiers. For many Romans, this was shocking. The Republic prided itself on military discipline, on order, on the invincibility of its legions. To be outwitted by slaves was unthinkable. And here the story begins to take on an almost eerie quality. Rumors grew. Some whispered that Spartacus was more than a man, that he was touched by fate, guided by omens. Ancient writers record that his wife, the Thracian seeress, claimed a snake had once coiled itself around Spartacus while he slept, a sign from the gods that he would rise to greatness. To Romans steeped in superstition, such tales were unsettling. Imagine the fear this must have inspired. Slaves whispering by lamplight, "Spartacus is coming." Families locking their doors at night, afraid that the rebellion would sweep into their towns. Wealthy households tightening their guard, fearful that their own servants might rise against them. The revolt was no longer just a nuisance. It had become a terror, a shadow stretching across Italy. The Senate realized it now faced not a band of fugitives, but a genuine war. For the rebels, victories brought confidence. They began to train more seriously, to build some order among their forces. What had started with kitchen knives was now becoming an army, and yet it was also an army without a clear future. Some wanted to march north, to leave Italy, and return to their homes. Others dreamed of overthrowing Rome itself. Disagreements brewed like low thunder on the horizon. But for the moment, the rebellion burned brightly. Rome was shaken. The countryside stirred with unease. And Spartacus, the Thracian slave, stood at the center of it all. For nearly 2 years, Spartacus and his army of escaped slaves had roamed the Italian peninsula, outwitting Roman generals and shaking the confidence of the Republic itself. Yet Rome was never a power to be underestimated. Patient, determined, and relentless, the Senate had learned from its early mistakes. This time, they would bring overwhelming force, discipline, and terror to crush the rebellion once and for all. The man chosen for this task was Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus was not only the richest man in Rome, but also a figure of immense ambition. To him, the suppression of Spartacus was not simply a duty, it was a stepping stone to greater glory, a way to carve his name into Roman history. He understood something that earlier generals had ignored. Spartacus and his men were no mere rabble. They were disciplined, hardened, and desperate. To defeat them, Rome had to respond with equal discipline, and with a cruelty that would terrify even the boldest heart. Crassus restored order among his own troops with a measure so brutal it had been rarely used in centuries: decimation. When his legions faltered, he ordered every 10th man executed by his comrades. Imagine the dread in those camps, the silent nights broken only by the sound of soldiers drawing lots. knowing that disobedience or cowardice would mean death at the hands of their brothers in arms. Harsh though it was, this punishment worked. Fear forged the Roman army back into shape. And once again, the legions moved with precision. Meanwhile, Spartacus and his followers faced a turning point. Some urged him to march north, to escape into Gaul or Thrace, where freedom might still be possible. Others whispered of marching directly on Rome itself, striking at the very heart of the Republic. Ancient sources disagree on his intentions, but the truth may lie somewhere between. Spartacus was not merely a fugitive. By this point, he was a leader of tens of thousands. Whether he sought to flee or to conquer, the rebellion had grown beyond simple survival. It had become a movement that terrified the most powerful state in the world. Crassus understood this, and he devised a plan to trap the rebels once and for all. In southern Italy, he ordered the construction of massive fortifications trenches, walls and earthworks stretching across the narrow land. It was a staggering feat of labor, one that turned the landscape itself into a weapon against Spartacus. Imagine being among the rebels, looking out at the vast lines of earthworks, realizing that the Romans had built a prison across the very land you hoped would grant you freedom. Supplies dwindled, food grew scarce, and the once proud rebellion began to weaken. Yet Spartacus refused to surrender. In a daring night maneuver, his followers filled in a section of the trench with timber and earth, creating a passage through which they escaped. Once again, he had proven himself a master of improvisation, a man who would not bow easily to Rome. But each escape left the rebels more desperate, more fractured. Time and fortune were running out. Rome, meanwhile, tightened its grip. Pompey, returning from his victories in Spain, brought another Roman army into the field. Crassus knew that if Spartacus remained undefeated, the glory of victory might fall to his rival. He marched his legions with ruthless determination, cornering Spartacus' weary forces near the river Silarus in 71 BCE. The final battle was fierce, chaotic, and desperate. Ancient writers describe Spartacus slaying his own horse before the fight, declaring that if he won, he would have many more, but if he lost, he would need none. It was an act of grim defiance, a signal that he expected victory or death. When the fighting began, Spartacus is said to have fought his way toward Crassus himself, cutting through Roman soldiers as he advanced. The image is striking, one man scarred and weary, yet still burning with unyielding determination, striving to strike at the very heart of Rome's power. But the legions were too many, too disciplined, surrounded, outnumbered, and exhausted. Spartacus fell. No one could identify his body in the chaos of the battlefield. Perhaps it was lost among the thousands of dead. Perhaps trampled into the soil. In death as in life, Spartacus remained elusive, more legend than man. For the survivors, there was no mercy. Rome made an example of them with a cruelty designed to echo across generations. 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, the great road stretching from Capua to the gates of Rome. Imagine walking that road in the weeks that followed. Mile after mile of wooden crosses, each bearing a lifeless body swaying in the wind. Travelers could not look away, for the warning was too clear. This is what happens to those who defy Rome. The crucifixions stood for weeks, perhaps months, as the bodies withered under sun and rain. To the Romans, it was justice. To the slaves and common people who saw it, it was terror incarnate. The Appian Way became less a road than a corridor of shadows, haunted by groans carried in the wind. And yet, Spartacus' rebellion could not be forgotten. Even in crushing him, Rome revealed its deepest fear, that those it enslaved might rise, that the foundations of power could tremble from below. Spartacus had no monuments, no state, no writings to preserve his memory. And still, his story lived on, retold in whispers, reshaped in legends, carried forward as both a warning and an inspiration. Some claimed his ghost lingered on the battlefields of southern Italy, a restless spirit unwilling to accept defeat. Others said the crucified along the Appian Way moaned at night, their voices riding on the breeze. Whether true or not, such tales reveal the mark Spartacus left on Rome's imagination. To the Roman elite, he was a criminal, a slave who dared to challenge the natural order. To later generations, he became a symbol of freedom, courage, and defiance. His rise and fall remind us that even in the most rigid societies, where power seems absolute, resistance can ignite in the unlikeliest of places, in the heart of one enslaved man. He's forced to fight for entertainment, yet unwilling to accept chains as his destiny. So ends the story of Spartacus. His rebellion was crushed, his followers scattered, and Rome stood triumphant. But in the quiet of history, his name endures. Tonight, as you drift to sleep, let the memory of his struggles soften into a gentle thought, that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit seeks freedom. The noise of battle fades, the crosses along the road fall to dust, but the echo of Spartacus remains, a whisper from the past, carried into the silence of the night.